The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pacific Ocean on December 7, 1941, as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the flagship Nagato, knowing that within hours, his meticulously planned gamble would either secure Japan's empire or doom it to destruction. 7,000 miles away, Rear Admiral Patrick Bellinger was completing his routine morning inspection at Pearl Harbor, unaware that 353 Japanese aircraft were already airborne, racing toward his unsuspecting naval base, with orders to cripple America's Pacific Fleet in a single devastating blow. The roots of this calculated assault stretched deep into Japan's imperial ambitions, born from decades of economic pressure and strategic desperation. Since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan had transformed itself from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial power. But this transformation came with a terrible price: complete dependence on foreign resources. The island nation possessed virtually no oil, rubber, or iron ore, forcing Japanese leaders to look outward for the materials necessary to sustain their growing empire. Emperor Hirohito's government had watched with mounting alarm as Western powers imposed increasingly severe economic sanctions following Japan's invasion of China in 1937. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration had systematically tightened the economic noose, freezing Japanese assets and implementing a total embargo on oil exports that threatened to strangle Japan's war machine within months. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had risen to power in October 1941, faced an impossible choice: abandon Japan's imperial dreams, or strike decisively against the only force capable of stopping Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia. The strategic calculations were brutally simple yet elegantly complex. Japan needed the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the rice paddies of Burma to sustain its empire. But seizing these territories would inevitably provoke American military intervention. The United States Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor, represented the primary obstacle to Japanese conquest, its 8 battleships and supporting vessels capable of projecting American power across the Pacific Ocean in a matter of weeks. Admiral Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of Japan's naval strategy, understood better than anyone that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial might. His staff had calculated that the United States could produce ships, aircraft, and weapons at a rate that would overwhelm Japanese manufacturing capacity within 2 years. The only hope lay in delivering such a devastating blow to American naval power that Roosevelt's government would be forced to negotiate a settlement recognizing Japan's new Pacific Empire as an irreversible fact. According to military records maintained by the Imperial War Museums, Japan's strategic planning was driven by the urgent need for economic self-sufficiency in the face of Western embargoes. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor crystallized during a series of imperial conferences held throughout November 1941, where Japan's military leadership concluded that diplomatic negotiations had reached a dead end. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura continued his meetings with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, discussing trade agreements and regional stability. But these talks served merely as cover for military preparations that had already passed the point of no return. General Hajime Sugiyama, Chief of the Army General Staff, had argued for immediate action before Japan's oil reserves fell below critical levels. His intelligence reports indicated that American military preparations in the Philippines and Hawaii were proceeding rapidly, making delay increasingly dangerous. Every month of hesitation strengthened American defenses while weakening Japan's capacity for decisive action. The human element of this strategic calculation weighed heavily on some Japanese leaders, particularly those who had lived in the United States and understood American industrial capacity. Ambassador Joseph Grew had warned Tokyo that Americans possessed a fighting spirit that would not be easily broken by military setbacks, but his cautionary messages were dismissed by military hardliners, convinced that a swift, decisive victory would force American negotiators to accept Japanese conquest as inevitable. As Yamamoto's strike force steamed eastward through rough North Pacific waters, maintaining strict radio silence to avoid detection, the weight of Japan's imperial destiny rested on the shoulders of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida and his fellow pilots. They carried not just bombs and torpedoes, but the hopes and fears of an entire nation that had gambled everything on a single morning of calculated violence that would reshape the balance of power across the Pacific Ocean. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, 6 aircraft carriers escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 23 submarines, all converging on Hawaiian waters with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku represented the finest vessels in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their combined air wings trained to perfection through months of rigorous preparation that had transformed ordinary pilots into instruments of calculated destruction. The operational planning for what Japanese strategists codenamed Operation Z required unprecedented coordination between intelligence gathering, diplomatic deception, and tactical innovation. Captain Minoru Genda, Yamamoto's chief planning officer, had spent over a year studying Pearl Harbor's defenses, analyzing reconnaissance photographs and interrogating Japanese nationals who had worked in Hawaii. His staff had constructed detailed models of the harbor, complete with miniature battleships positioned exactly as American vessels typically moored at Ford Island. The technical challenges of attacking Pearl Harbor's shallow waters had demanded innovative solutions that pushed Japanese engineering to its limits. Standard aerial torpedoes would bury themselves in the harbor's 40-foot depth before reaching their targets, forcing Japanese technicians to develop wooden stabilizing fins that would keep the weapons running at optimal depth. These modifications, tested extensively in Kagoshima Bay using captured Chinese vessels as targets, transformed conventional weapons into harbor-specific instruments of precision destruction. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led the torpedo bomber squadron. His 40 pilots trained to approach their targets at extremely low altitude while maintaining perfect formation discipline. Each airman had memorized the layout of Pearl Harbor until they could navigate the complex waterway blindfolded, their intensive preparation reflecting Japanese understanding that this single operation would determine their nation's fate in the coming war. The diplomatic dimension of Japan's deception required Ambassador Nomura to maintain the facade of ongoing negotiations even as the strike force crossed the Pacific. His meetings with American officials continued throughout late November and early December, with both sides discussing trade agreements and regional security arrangements that everyone knew had become meaningless formalities. The ambassador's genuine desire for peace made him an effective, unwitting accomplice in Japan's elaborate charade. Emperor Hirohito had given his formal approval for the Pearl Harbor operation during the Imperial Conference of December 1st, though historical evidence suggests he harbored serious doubts about the wisdom of provoking American military intervention. His decision reflected the influence of military advisors who had convinced him that Japan faced immediate economic collapse unless it secured access to Southeast Asian resources through military conquest. Naval History magazine documented that Japanese strategic planners envisioned a 2-part mission, expanding southward into resource-rich territories while protecting Japan from expected American counterattacks. The strike force had departed from Hitakapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands on November 26th, following a northern route, through stormy seas that would minimize the risk of detection by American reconnaissance flights or merchant vessels. The fleet maintained absolute radio silence during the 13-day voyage, with communications limited to flag signals and coded light displays that required exceptional seamanship in the rough North Pacific waters. Admiral Nagumo faced the constant tension between maintaining operational security and ensuring tactical readiness as his force approached Hawaiian waters. Weather conditions threatened to disrupt the carefully choreographed attack sequence, while fuel consumption rates pushed his destroyers to their operational limits. The success of Japan's entire Pacific strategy depended on achieving complete tactical surprise, making every decision during the approach phase critically important. The human cost of maintaining such rigid operational discipline became apparent as Japanese sailors endured weeks of enforced silence, forbidden even to transmit routine maintenance reports that might compromise the mission. Petty Officer Iki Kuramori later described the voyage as sailing into the mouth of the dragon, with every man aboard understanding that they were committed to an operation that would either establish Japanese dominance across the Pacific or trigger a war that Japan could not hope to win. Commander Fuchida conducted final briefings for his air crews, as the strike force reached its launch position 230 miles north of Oahu. His pilots understood that they were not merely attacking a naval base, but attempting to reshape the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War through a single morning of precisely executed violence that would either secure Japan's empire or seal its doom. At 7:48 on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the tranquil calm of Pearl Harbor shattered as the first Japanese bombs began falling on Ford Island, transforming a peaceful Sunday morning into a scene of unprecedented destruction that would echo through American consciousness for generations. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida transmitted his famous message, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" confirming that complete tactical surprise had been achieved, as hundreds of American servicemen scrambled from their bunks to confront an enemy they never expected to face on Hawaiian soil. The battleship row along Ford Island's eastern shore presented Japanese torpedo bombers with perfect targets, 8 massive vessels moored in pairs that offered no opportunity for evasive maneuvering. The Oklahoma, nested alongside the Maryland, absorbed 5 torpedo hits in rapid succession, her 35,000-ton hull rolling completely over within 20 minutes, as 429 sailors trapped below decks drowned in the capsizing vessel. Captain Howard Bode watched helplessly from the Maryland's bridge as his neighbor ship disappeared beneath the harbor's oily surface. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito's high-level bombers were making their deadly runs against the Arizona, their modified 16-inch armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate the battleship's heavily armored decks. At 8:06, one of these weapons found its mark, striking the forward magazine and creating a fireball that lifted the massive vessel's bow section completely out of the water. The explosion instantly killed 1,177 sailors and Marines, including Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg and Admiral Isaac Kidd, whose bodies were never recovered from the twisted wreckage. The West Virginia, despite absorbing 7 torpedo hits from Murata's squadron, was saved from capsizing by the quick thinking of Lieutenant Commander John Harper, who ordered counter-flooding that kept the ship upright, though settling to the harbor bottom. Petty Officer Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant, manned a .50 caliber machine gun despite having no training on the weapon, shooting down at least 1 Japanese aircraft while helping to carry his wounded captain to safety. Admiral Husband Kimmel watched the destruction from his headquarters window, his face pale with shock as he realized the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before his eyes. The Pacific Fleet's battle line, carefully arranged to provide mutual protection and efficient logistics support, had become a death trap that allowed Japanese attackers to systematically destroy America's primary naval deterrent in the Pacific. The second wave of Japanese attackers, arriving at 900 hours under Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki's command, encountered increased resistance as American gunners recovered from their initial shock and began returning fire with whatever weapons they could bring to bear. The destroyer Helm, one of the few vessels to get underway during the attack, engaged Japanese aircraft with her 5-inch guns while steaming toward the harbor entrance at flank speed. The Gilder Lehrman Institute documented that Japanese pilots achieved their primary objective of devastating the entire United States Pacific Fleet, leaving 2,403 Americans dead and 1,178 wounded. At Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor, Technical Sergeant Wilbur Hunt led a desperate effort to save undamaged aircraft from the systematic destruction being wrought by Japanese fighters. His mechanics worked frantically to start engines and taxi bombers to safety, while strafing attacks destroyed dozens of aircraft lined up wingtip to wingtip on the flight line. Hunt personally engaged a Japanese fighter with a machine gun salvaged from a destroyed bomber, demonstrating the kind of improvised heroism that characterized American response throughout the attack. The Nevada, getting underway despite taking a torpedo hit early in the attack, became a magnet for dive bombers seeking to sink her in the harbor channel and potentially block the entire naval base. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas conned the massive battleship through a gauntlet of bombs and strafing attacks, eventually beaching her near Hospital Point to prevent the channel blockage that would have crippled Pearl Harbor for months. Hospital. Corpsman 3rd Class. Robert Bennett dove repeatedly into the burning waters around the Arizona, pulling wounded sailors to safety despite severe burns covering most of his own body. His actions, repeated throughout the harbor by hundreds of sailors and officers, began the process of transforming disaster into determination that would sustain American forces through the dark months ahead. The human dimension of Japan's calculated strike extended beyond military casualties as civilian populations throughout Honolulu experienced modern warfare for the first time. Mrs. Mary Naden, a Navy wife living near Pearl Harbor, described watching the end of the world through our kitchen window as Japanese aircraft swept over residential neighborhoods while returning to their carriers. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon at approximately 1000 hours, Pearl Harbor resembled a vision from Dante's Inferno, with smoke columns rising thousands of feet into the tropical sky, while rescue crews worked frantically to save trapped sailors from sinking ships. The calculated nature of Japan's assault had achieved tactical success beyond their most optimistic projections, but the strategic consequences of their surprise attack were only beginning to unfold. The immediate aftermath of Japan's meticulously executed assault revealed both the stunning success and fatal limitations of their strategic calculations. As Admiral Nagumo's strike force withdrew northward, having achieved tactical victory while simultaneously guaranteeing the total war they had hoped to avoid. The destruction of America's Pacific Fleet battle line was undeniable. 8 battleships sunk or severely damaged, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 auxiliary vessels eliminated as effective fighting units, along with 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could mount any meaningful defense. However, the absence of American aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor represented a critical flaw in Japanese intelligence that would haunt their Pacific strategy for years to come. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga remained operational, providing the United States Navy with the foundation for carrier-based operations that would eventually dominate Pacific warfare. Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 8 had departed Pearl Harbor just days before the Japanese arrival, taking the Enterprise and her escorts on a routine mission to Wake Island, while the Lexington conducted training exercises near Midway Island. The strategic petroleum reserves at Pearl Harbor, containing 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil essential for naval operations, remained largely untouched by Japanese bombers focused on ships and aircraft. Captain Mervyn Bennion, mortally wounded aboard the West Virginia, had used his final moments to direct damage control efforts that prevented fires from spreading to nearby fuel storage facilities. The preservation of these supplies would prove crucial to American naval operations throughout 1942, enabling sustained fleet operations that might otherwise have been impossible. Admiral Nagumo's decision to decline his subordinates' requests for a third wave assault reflected the conservative mentality that would repeatedly limit Japanese tactical success throughout the Pacific War. Commander Minoru Genda had argued forcefully for additional strikes against Pearl Harbor's dry docks, machine shops, and fuel storage facilities, understanding that destroying these installations would cripple American recovery efforts far more effectively than sinking additional ships. Lieutenant General Walter Short, commanding Hawaiian Department Ground Forces, faced the immediate challenge of preparing for a potential Japanese invasion that never materialized. The attack had caught his forces completely unprepared, with ammunition stored separately from weapons and air defense batteries positioned to defend against sabotage rather than aerial assault. His subsequent relief from command, along with Admiral Kimmel's removal, reflected American military demands for accountability in the face of unprecedented disaster. The Japanese strike force's withdrawal proceeded without incident, as American forces lacked both the capability and organization to mount an immediate counterattack. The few American aircraft that managed to get airborne during the attack were quickly overwhelmed by superior Japanese numbers and training, though several pilots demonstrated exceptional courage in hopeless circumstances. The National World War II Museum's historical analysis indicates that Japan's attack was specifically designed to immobilize the Pacific Fleet and prevent American interference with Japanese invasion plans across Southeast Asia. President Franklin Roosevelt's War Cabinet convened an emergency session as reports of the Pearl Harbor disaster reached Washington, with Secretary of War Henry Stimson describing the attack as the most serious military defeat in American history. The magnitude of Japanese success exceeded even their own expectations, creating a sense of strategic vulnerability that would influence American military planning throughout the early months of the Pacific War. The human dimension of Japan's calculated strike extended far beyond military casualties, as medical personnel at Pearl Harbor's hospital facilities worked throughout the day, treating wounds unlike anything they had encountered in peacetime service. Lieutenant Ruth Erickson, a Navy nurse, later recalled that the hospital resembled a battlefield aid station from the Civil War, with wounded sailors covering every available surface, while doctors performed surgery without adequate supplies or equipment. Captain Logan Ramsey, duty officer at Ford Island's command center, had transmitted the first official word of the attack at 7:58. Air raid Pearl Harbor X. This is no drill. His message electrified military commands across the Pacific, triggering alert protocols that transformed theoretical contingency plans into immediate operational reality. The calculated nature of Japan's strike became apparent through intercepted communications revealing that Ambassador Nomura had been instructed to deliver Japan's declaration of war precisely 30 minutes before the attack began. Technical difficulties with decoding and translating the lengthy Japanese message meant that Nomura arrived at the State Department nearly an hour after bombs had already begun falling on Pearl Harbor, creating the impression of a deliberately treacherous assault that would complicate all future diplomatic efforts. The strategic petroleum reserves, repair facilities, and submarine base at Pearl Harbor remained largely intact, providing the foundation for American recovery that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate or prevent through their otherwise brilliantly executed surprise attack. President Franklin Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8, 1941, transformed Japan's calculated military strike into a moral crusade that united American public opinion as no other event in the nation's history had achieved. His description of December 7th as a date which will live in infamy crystallized American anger into iron determination, ensuring that the United States would commit its full industrial and military potential to defeating Japanese imperialism, regardless of the cost in blood and treasure. The Japanese High Command's fundamental assumption that Americans lacked the will for prolonged warfare proved catastrophically incorrect within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack. Rather than demoralizing the American public, the surprise assault galvanized popular support for military action that had been impossible to achieve through diplomatic crises or foreign conflicts. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, previously a leading isolationist, declared that we are all internationalists now, reflecting the profound shift in American political consciousness that Japan's attack had inadvertently created. Admiral Ernest King, appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet following the Pearl Harbor disaster, immediately began implementing aggressive strategies that contradicted Japanese expectations of defensive American behavior. His directive to subordinate commanders emphasized offensive action at every opportunity, regardless of immediate tactical disadvantages. This aggressive mindset would characterize American naval operations throughout the Pacific War, creating constant pressure on Japanese forces that had expected a more cautious opponent. The industrial mobilization triggered by Pearl Harbor exceeded even the most optimistic American projections, as factories converted from civilian to military production with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Henry Kaiser's shipyards began producing Liberty ships at rates that astounded both American planners and Japanese intelligence analysts, while aircraft manufacturers expanded production capabilities beyond anything Japanese strategic planners had considered possible when calculating America's probable response to their surprise attack. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, appointed to command Pacific Fleet operations following Admiral Kimmel's removal, inherited a situation that appeared hopeless but contained unexpected opportunities. The destruction of America's battleship fleet forced tactical innovations emphasizing aircraft carriers and amphibious operations that proved far more effective against Japanese island defenses than traditional naval bombardment would have been. This tactical revolution, born from necessity, ultimately gave American forces decisive advantages in the Pacific theater. The survival of Pearl Harbor's repair facilities enabled American forces to begin recovery operations almost immediately after the attack concluded. The battleship Nevada, deliberately grounded to prevent sinking in the main channel, was refloated and returned to service within months, her reconstruction incorporating lessons learned from Japanese attack methods. Similarly, The California and West Virginia were razed, rebuilt, and modernized to serve effectively throughout the remainder of the war. Historical records indicate that Japan's motivation for attacking Pearl Harbor was driven by political self-interests and the urgent need to secure natural resources, as documented by the Association for Asian Studies. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, began piecing together evidence of Japanese strategic intentions through careful analysis of communication intercepts and prisoner interrogations. His work revealed that Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was merely the opening move in a much larger campaign designed to establish an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Understanding Japanese strategy enabled American commanders to develop effective countermeasures that exploited enemy assumptions about American capabilities and intentions. The moral dimension of Japan's surprise attack complicated diplomatic efforts throughout the Pacific War, as American negotiators consistently demanded unconditional surrender rather than accepting the negotiated peace that Japanese leaders had originally hoped to achieve. The treacherous nature of the Pearl Harbor assault, in American perception, made any compromise with Japanese militarism politically impossible and morally unacceptable to a public that viewed the attack as an act of unprecedented betrayal. 3. Phoenix Program, America's systematic effort to raise and rebuild ships damaged at Pearl Harbor, demonstrated industrial capabilities that Japanese planners had never anticipated when calculating America's probable response to their surprise attack. The battleship Pennsylvania, damaged during the December 7th assault, returned to action with enhanced anti-aircraft armament and modern radar systems that made her more effective than she had been before the Japanese attack. The human cost of Japan's strategic gamble extended far beyond military casualties, as American industrial mobilization drew millions of women and minorities into war production roles that permanently transformed American society. The Pearl Harbor attack had created not just military necessity, but social revolution, as traditional barriers collapsed under the pressure of total war mobilization that Japanese strategists had never anticipated or planned for when designing their carefully calculated strike. The strategic lessons emerging from Pearl Harbor's ashes would influence American military doctrine for generations, establishing principles of preparedness, intelligence gathering, and rapid response that reflected hard-learned truths about the nature of modern warfare in an interconnected world where surprise attacks could reshape entire civilizations within a matter of hours. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the fundamental miscalculations underlying Japan's surprise attack became devastatingly apparent during the Battle of Midway, where American codebreakers and carrier aviation destroyed 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that had participated in the Hawaiian operation. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the same strike force that had achieved such stunning success at Pearl Harbor, watched helplessly as the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were reduced to flaming wrecks by American dive bombers operating from the Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet. The strategic irony was inescapable. Japan's perfectly executed surprise attack had guaranteed the total war they sought to avoid, while their tactical brilliance at Pearl Harbor had taught American forces invaluable lessons about carrier operations that would dominate Pacific warfare. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers found Nagumo's carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with aircraft being refueled and rearmed on their flight decks, recreating the same conditions that had made Pearl Harbor such a devastating success for Japanese attackers. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death on April 18, 1943, when American fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville, symbolized the complete failure of Japan's Pearl Harbor strategy. The architect of the surprise attack perished in an ambush made possible by the same code-breaking capabilities that had enabled American victory at Midway. His loss deprived Japan of its most capable naval strategist precisely when strategic leadership was most desperately needed to salvage something from the deteriorating Pacific situation. The industrial mobilization that Pearl Harbor had triggered transformed the United States into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, producing ships, aircraft, and weapons at rates that overwhelmed Japanese manufacturing capacity, exactly as Yamamoto had predicted before the war began. American shipyards launched more vessels in 1943 alone than Japan produced during the entire Pacific War, while aircraft production reached levels that Japanese planners had dismissed as impossible when calculating America's probable response to their surprise attack. Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender on August 15, 1945, represented the final acknowledgement that Japan's Pearl Harbor calculations had been fundamentally flawed from their inception. The atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with Soviet entry into the Pacific War, demonstrated that Japan's surprise attack had ultimately guaranteed the complete destruction of the empire it was intended to protect. The calculated strike had become an exercise in national suicide stretched across 4 years of increasingly desperate warfare. The war crimes trials conducted in Tokyo following Japan's surrender revealed the extent to which Pearl Harbor had been planned as a deliberate violation of international law, with Japanese leaders consciously choosing to attack before declaring war. General Tojo's execution in December 1948 represented not just personal accountability, but symbolic justice for the treacherous assault that had triggered 4 years of Pacific warfare and ultimately led to Japan's complete defeat. The Imperial War Museum's historical analysis confirms that Japanese strategic thinkers believed they needed economic self-sufficiency to wage modern war, but their Pearl Harbor attack ultimately guaranteed the protracted conflict they sought to avoid. The memorial erected over the Arizona's remains became a permanent reminder of the price paid for Japan's strategic miscalculations, with the battleship's hull serving as the tomb for over 1,000 sailors who died in the December 7th attack. Visitors to Pearl Harbor could see oil still seeping from the wreckage, creating what locals called the Tears of the Arizona, a perpetual reminder of the morning when Japanese calculations collided with American reality and triggered a war that consumed the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz's final assessment of the Pearl Harbor attack, delivered during the Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, captured the historical irony of Japan's calculated gamble. The attack that was intended to prevent American interference in Japanese expansion ultimately guaranteed that interference would be total, sustained, and ultimately victorious. The surprise that had seemed so devastating on December 7, 1941, had awakened American power that would reshape the entire Pacific region for generations to come. The strategic lessons of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond World War II, influencing American military doctrine throughout the Cold War and into the 21st century. The vulnerability demonstrated by Japan's surprise attack led to massive investments in early warning systems, intelligence capabilities, and rapid response forces designed to prevent any future Pearl Harbor-style catastrophe. Japan's calculated strike had taught America that preparedness was the only guarantee of security in an unpredictable world where enemies could strike without warning from unexpected directions. The human dimension of this transformation remained visible decades after the war's end, as Pearl Harbor survivors carried forward the memory of December 7th through their participation in memorial services and educational programs. Their testimonies preserved the emotional reality of Japan's surprise attack, ensuring that future generations would understand not just the strategic calculations that led to Pearl Harbor, but the human cost of decisions made in Imperial Conference rooms thousands of miles from the sailors who paid the ultimate price for Japan's miscalculated gamble. The final accounting of Japan's Pearl Harbor strategy revealed a paradox that military historians continue to study. A tactically perfect operation that achieved complete surprise and devastating results, yet ultimately guaranteed the very outcome it was designed to prevent. Japan's calculated strike had indeed awakened a sleeping giant, filling it with the terrible resolve that would not rest until the empire that launched the Pearl Harbor attack had been completely and utterly destroyed.